The clash between two formidable Native American tribes, the Comanche and Apache, is a lesser-known but crucial chapter in the annals of history, marked by bloodshed, strategy, and a relentless pursuit of survival. This was no simple territorial dispute over land or resources. It was an existential battle for dominance, waged on the brutal plains of the American Southwest. Long before the age of drones, automatic weapons, and modern warfare, these two warrior societies clashed in a struggle where only the strongest could lay claim to the right to exist. By the late 1500s, the Apache stood as masters of the southern Great Plains. Their control of vast expanses of land allowed them to thrive, farming, hunting buffalo, and trading with neighboring tribes. But beneath the surface of this power was a looming shadow, an encroaching force that would soon threaten their very existence. That force was the Comanche, a tribe once relegated to the fringes of survival, seen by many as outcasts of the plains. But what they lacked in numbers or land, they made up for with unparalleled ferocity, unmatched horsemanship, and an unrelenting thirst for vengeance. The early 1600s saw the Apache nation in a golden age of power. Their warriors were fierce, their alliances strong, and their knowledge of the land unmatched. Yet, in the peripheries of this powerful empire, the Comanche began to stir. Driven from their ancestral lands by other tribes and forced into the desolate reaches of what is now Wyoming, the Comanche did not simply fade into obscurity. Instead, they adapted. They turned their harsh environment into a crucible of strength, crafting a warrior society so fierce and unyielding that it would soon strike fear into the hearts of even the most battle-hardened Apache. The coming decades would see the Comanche evolve from a marginalized group into one of the most feared and respected tribes on the continent. Their mastery of the horse gave them a tactical advantage that few could match, allowing them to launch devastating raids with unprecedented speed and precision. The Comanche did not just fight wars. They waged campaigns of terror, taking captives, decimating villages, and laying waste to entire regions. Their rise was meteoric, and by the mid-1600s, they had transformed from a tribe on the brink of extinction to a fearsome force that even the mighty Apache would come to dread. For the Apache, the arrival of the Comanche heralded a dark and uncertain future. The Apache had long relied on their knowledge of the land and their skill as warriors to maintain control over the plains. But the Comanche brought a new kind of warfare, one that was swift, brutal, and unrelenting. The Comanche's ability to strike hard and fast, often under the cover of night, left Apache villages vulnerable. One by one, strongholds that had stood for generations fell, and the once proud Apache were forced to retreat. This war was not just a matter of territory. It was a clash of cultures, ideologies, and ways of life. The Apache fought to defend their ancestral lands, their way of life, and their very identity as a people. The Comanche, on the other hand, were fighting to carve out a place for themselves in a world that had long sought to push them aside. For the Comanche, victory meant more than just survival. It meant dominance. And to achieve that dominance, they were willing to do whatever it took. As the war dragged on, the tactics employed by both sides grew increasingly ruthless. The Apache, once known for their strategic brilliance and hit-and-run warfare, found themselves outmatched by the sheer ferocity of the Comanche. Where the Apache relied on the terrain and their deep knowledge of the land, the Comanche relied on their unmatched mobility and fearlessness in battle. Time and time again, the Comanche would strike deep into Apache territory, raiding villages, stealing horses, and taking captives. And each time, they would slip away into the night, leaving destruction and chaos in their wake. The Apache responded in kind, launching counter-raids against Comanche camps, seeking to inflict as much damage as possible on their enemies. But for every victory the Apache claimed, the Comanche would return with even greater fury. It was a brutal cycle of violence, vengeance, and bloodshed that would continue for decades, with no end in sight. By the late 1600s, the once dominant Apache were in retreat. The relentless pressure of the Comanche onslaught had pushed them to the brink. Villages that had stood for generations lay in ruins, and entire bands of Apache warriors had been decimated. The Comanche, fueled by their growing power and the spoils of war, continued to press their advantage, driving the Apache further and further south. It was during this period that the Apache made a fateful decision. Recognizing that they could no longer stand alone against the Comanche, they sought alliances with other tribes and even European settlers. The Spanish, who had established colonies in what is now Mexico and the American Southwest, became valuable allies to the Apache. In exchange for protection and military support, the Apache agreed to assist the Spanish in their efforts to colonize the region. But even with these new alliances, the Apache found themselves outmatched by the relentless Comanche. The war between the Comanche and the Apache was not one of glorious battles or heroic deeds. It was a war of attrition, fought in the shadows and on the open plains. It was a war where survival was the only measure of success, and where the line between victory and defeat was often blurred. For the Apache, the war marked the end of their dominance on the southern Great Plains. By the early 1700s, the once mighty Apache had been forced to abandon much of their territory, retreating to the mountains and deserts of the Southwest. For the Comanche, the war marked the beginning of their rise to power. With the Apache in retreat, the Comanche expanded their territory, establishing themselves as the dominant force on the southern plains. Their control of the region would last for nearly a century, during which they would continue to wage war against other tribes, settlers, and even the United States government. The Comanche-Apache War is a testament to the resilience and tenacity of both tribes. It was a war that shaped the future of the American Southwest and left a lasting impact on the history of the region. Though the Apache were ultimately defeated, their legacy as fierce warriors and defenders of their people lives on. And while the Comanche would eventually face their own challenges and decline, their rise to power during this brutal conflict stands as a testament to their strength and determination. This untold saga of a brutal war between two of history's most formidable warrior societies remains a crucial, though often overlooked, chapter in the history of the American West. It serves as a reminder of the harsh realities of survival, the cost of war, and the indomitable spirit of the Native American tribes who fought to protect their land, their people, and their way of life. However, it was their discovery of a new weapon, the horse, that would dramatically alter their future. While horses had long been used by the Spanish colonizers, it was the Comanche who turned them into instruments of war, becoming master horsemen and eventually one of the most dominant tribes in American history. The Spanish, having had success in Mexico throughout the 1500s, were intent on expanding their reach. By the early 1600s, they began moving into what is now New Mexico, bringing with them firearms, metal armor, and horses. Their violent conquests had already decimated native populations in Central and South America, and now the Apache were next in their sights. But the Apache were not passive victims. They retaliated by attacking Spanish settlements and stealing their horses, quickly learning to ride them and turning the tables on their European adversaries. However, it was their discovery of a new weapon, the horse, that would dramatically alter their future. The horse, which had been introduced to the Americas by the Spanish colonizers, became a pivotal tool of transformation for the Comanche. For centuries, the Spanish had relied on horses for transportation and warfare, but it was the Comanche who turned these animals into fearsome instruments of war. In doing so, they became the master horsemen of the plains, and their rise to power is a story that would forever change the course of Native American history. The Spanish, riding high on their conquests in Mexico throughout the 1500s, had their sights set on expanding their empire. By the early 1600s, they began pushing northward into what is now New Mexico, driven by a thirst for more land and resources. They brought with them the tools of European warfare: firearms, metal armor, and of course, horses. Having already decimated the native populations of Central and South America through violent conquests, the Spanish now turned their gaze toward the tribes of the American Southwest. Among their targets were the Apache, whose lands were rich in resources and strategic importance. But the Apache were no strangers to warfare, nor were they willing to become passive victims of the Spanish advance. The arrival of the Spanish brought new challenges, but it also presented new opportunities. The Apache quickly recognized the value of the Spanish horses and wasted no time in seizing them. Raids on Spanish settlements became common, with Apache warriors stealing horses and supplies. In time, the Apache learned to ride these animals, mastering the skill with the same intensity and determination that they brought to every aspect of their survival. The balance of power began to shift. The horse, which had been a symbol of Spanish dominance, became a tool of rebellion for the Apache. Mounted on horseback, Apache warriors could now strike with greater speed and efficiency than ever before. What had once been a purely defensive fight to protect their lands now transformed into a new kind of warfare. Armed with stolen Spanish horses, the Apache raiders became the scourge of the colonizers, launching swift attacks on settlements, driving off livestock, and disappearing into the vastness of the plains before their enemies had time to react. But as formidable as the Apache had become, they were not the only ones to benefit from the introduction of horses. To the north, the Comanche were also watching the movements of the Spanish and their Apache adversaries with keen interest. Driven from their ancestral lands and forced to survive in the harsh, unforgiving terrain of what is now Wyoming, the Comanche were eager to find a way to regain their strength and establish their dominance. The horse would prove to be their key to achieving that goal. In the mid-1600s, the Comanche began to acquire horses, either through raids or trade with neighboring tribes. Like the Apache, they quickly adapted to this new form of warfare, but the Comanche took it one step further. They became not only skilled horsemen, but legendary ones, known for their unparalleled mastery of riding and their ability to control vast herds. Their lives became intertwined with the horse in a way that was unmatched by any other tribe. The Comanche warriors became synonymous with their mounts, swift, agile, and utterly fearless. This newfound power transformed the Comanche into one of the most dominant forces on the southern Great Plains. Their ability to launch lightning-fast raids on horseback allowed them to expand their territory at an astonishing rate. No longer content to simply survive, the Comanche became conquerors, pushing out other tribes, including the Apache, and claiming vast swathes of land for themselves. Their rise was meteoric, and within a few short decades, they had gone from a marginalized people struggling to survive to the rulers of the Southern Plains. For the Apache, the rise of the Comanche represented a new and dangerous threat. Their once strong position in the region was now being undermined by this aggressive, horse-mounted tribe that seemed unstoppable. The Apache, who had once used horses to turn the tide against the Spanish, now found themselves on the defensive once again, this time against a foe who was even more adept at using horses in warfare than they were. The conflicts between the Apache and Comanche intensified as both tribes vied for control of the plains. The Spanish, meanwhile, continued to be caught in the crossfire of this escalating war. Their settlements were raided by both sides, and their attempts to maintain control over the region became increasingly futile. The Spanish had introduced the horse to the Americas, but they had unwittingly unleashed a force that they could no longer control. The tribes of the plains had adapted this new weapon to their own purposes, and the result was a level of warfare and mobility that the Spanish had never anticipated. The Comanche's dominance grew steadily throughout the late 1600s and into the 1700s. Their reputation as fearsome horsemen spread far and wide, and their raids became the stuff of legend. No village, no settlement, and no tribe were safe from their swift attacks. Even the Apache, who had once stood as one of the most powerful tribes in the region, were now struggling to hold on to their territory in the face of the Comanche onslaught. By the early 1700s, the Comanche had firmly established themselves as the rulers of the southern Great Plains. They controlled vast herds of horses, and their warriors were feared across the region. The Apache, meanwhile, had been forced to retreat to more defensible positions, their power diminished but not entirely broken. The war between the Comanche and Apache would continue for many years, but it was clear that the balance of power had shifted. The Comanche, with their mastery of the horse and their relentless pursuit of dominance, had risen to the top. The horse, once a symbol of Spanish power, had become the key to Comanche supremacy. The Comanche had not only survived, but thrived, using the very weapon that had been intended to conquer them. In the end, it was not the Spanish who would dictate the fate of the southern plains, but the Comanche, whose skill with the horse made them one of the most formidable tribes in American history. The story of the Comanche and Apache is a testament to the adaptability and resilience of Native American tribes, who, despite facing incredible odds, found ways to survive and even flourish in the face of adversity. By the 1650s, the Apache had perfected the art of war on horseback, launching raids with devastating speed and precision. Armed with their newfound mastery of the horse, they swept through Spanish settlements like ghosts in the night. Mounted Apache warriors would descend upon villages, plundering horses, food, weapons, and other supplies before disappearing into the wilderness as quickly as they had come. In the span of a single night, they could cripple a settlement, leaving the Spanish in chaos and confusion. Entire herds of horses, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, would be driven off, and the Spanish would find themselves powerless to stop it. The Apache's success on horseback marked a significant turning point in their conflict with the Spanish. No longer were they merely defending their lands from foreign invaders. Now they were on the offensive, using the very tools of their enemies to strike fear into their hearts. And as their power grew, so too did their boldness. The once dominant Spanish, who had terrorized the native peoples of the Americas for over a century, suddenly found themselves vulnerable, their settlements exposed to the relentless raids of the Apache. But the Apache were not alone in their struggle against the Spanish. The seeds of rebellion had been sown among other tribes as well, particularly the Pueblo people, who had long suffered under the yoke of Spanish oppression. The Spanish had sought to subjugate the Pueblo through forced labor, religious conversion, and violence, but the Pueblo were a proud and resilient people. By the late 1600s, tensions between the Pueblo and the Spanish had reached a breaking point. In 1680, the Pueblo, fueled by years of mistreatment, joined forces with the Apache in a massive revolt. The uprising was swift and brutal, catching the Spanish completely off guard. Led by a charismatic Pueblo leader named Pope, the combined forces of the Pueblo and Apache launched a coordinated attack on the Spanish settlements in New Mexico. The revolt was a resounding success. The Spanish, overwhelmed by the sheer force of the rebellion, were driven out of New Mexico, abandoning their missions, homes, and supplies as they fled south. For the first time in over a century, the native peoples had reclaimed their land from the colonizers. In their hasty retreat, the Spanish left behind over 1,000 horses. These horses, many of which were claimed by the Apache, would go on to play a crucial role in the history of the Great Plains. This breed of horse, which would later be known as the Mustang, became a symbol of freedom and resilience in the vast open plains of North America. The Apache, already skilled horsemen, now found themselves with even greater numbers of these powerful animals, further solidifying their dominance in the region.